I introduced this talk a little earlier, but I just briefly, this is called the Culavedalla Sutta, where the nun Dhammadinna teaches her ex-husband, also a member of the original Sangha, a very complete instruction on the Buddha's Dhamma, and very specifically to the 3 marks of existence. Dhammadinna's husband is known as Visakha, and he asks a question specifically about how does self-identification arise. And in her explanation of that, she touches on all 3 marks of existence, which is what the Buddha teaches we gain insight into in a very specific way. Let me skip over my introduction there. So Visakha asks his ex-wife, Dhammadinna, what is self-identification as described by the Buddha? Visakha, the Buddha teaches that self-identification is established by clinging to form, to feelings, to perceptions, to fabrications, and to consciousness. What are those 5 things? Yeah, everybody gets a go. And that last, just to be clear, that last reference to consciousness, it's often, anytime we hear consciousness in this kind of new age milieu that we're in, we think of some grand cosmic consciousness. That's not what we're referring to here. It's simply ongoing thinking rooted in ignorance of 4 noble truths. That results, it's that type of thinking that clings these aggregates together. And it is these 5 clinging aggregates that are the ongoing personal experience of suffering. It's just the Buddhist explanation of that. The reason why I say that is when we hear that term 5 clinging aggregates, when I could still see, I noticed that people's eyes would glaze over. It's because we don't understand something. And so we tend to dismiss the teaching when it simply describes the ongoing experience of suffering. And when we look at it in relation to each of the aggregates, to form, to feelings, to perceptions, to fabrications, to consciousness, we can clearly see that that is how we experience suffering, is through those aggregates and by personalizing those. Dhammadinna continues, these 5 clinging aggregates are the self-identification taught by the Buddha. I'm going to skip over some of my commentary. Visakha continues, your answer is very helpful. What then is the origination of self-identification to the 5 clinging aggregates, indeed to every thought? Dhammadinna replies, it is clinging, Visakha, that brings continual establishment of anatta, not self-characteristic, misunderstood views of self. Clinging born of craving accompanied by passion and delight, craving for sensual pleasure, craving for the continued establishment in this world and other realms. This is the origination of self-identification as taught by the Buddha. That last line, in other realms, refers to the common practice of establishing the self in non-physical imaginary realms, such as the realm or the dimension of infinite consciousness or infinite nothingness or any of these other non-physical realms. But it also relates to establishing ourselves in some type of self-referential ideology, such as I'm the world's smartest Buddhist, or my lineage is the best Buddhist lineage, or my political affiliation is the best and everybody else is wrong, or anything else. My membership in the Elks means that everybody else is foolish. Those are all establishments in non-physical realms that the Buddha's reference in many suttas and also here. It's important to remember that. The entire Dhamma develops the concentration and the refined mindfulness to recognize the how and the why of doing that, of establishing ourselves in ideology and non-physical realms and imaginary realms and magical thinking that are rooted in ignorance of 4 noble truths. An awakened human being simply sees itself in relation to the world clearly. It's not an escape. It's not any distraction. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's deep immersion in what's occurring in our life as our life unfolds. Visakha then asks, what then is the cessation of self-identification? It is the renunciation, the remainderless fading away of that very clinging born of craving. It's that originates the continual establishment of anatta, meaning when we're stuck in craving for self-identification and clinging to whatever we've developed through views rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths, clinging to those views, we are stuck in it. We've established it. So the very ending, the cessation of that process, the remainderless fading away. Remainderless means there's not a shred of ignorance left in our views. That's the cessation of self-identification. Dhammadinna continues, this is the cessation of self-identification as taught by the Buddha. What then, dear lady, is the path or the practice leading to the cessation of self-identification that is taught by the Buddha? This one, the answer to Dhammadinna's answer to that one question defines the entire Buddhist teaching as the path to awakening. And notice that she doesn't embellish what she's about to say in any way. She doesn't qualify it by saying you must do a certain number of rituals, you must memorize and use chanting, you must apply mindfulness in ways that the Buddha didn't teach mindfulness, you must worship gods, goddesses, or deities, or any hierarchical structure within a so-called Buddhist practice. Friend Visakha, it is precisely the noble eightfold path of right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation that the Buddha teaches to develop the virtue, the concentration, and the wisdom required to abandon self-identification and to abandon clinging. Again, this sutta points directly to the entire Buddhist teaching. The only path the Buddha ever taught was an eightfold path. He taught it for a very specific reason, to gain insight into the three marks of existence, including anatta, including self-identification. Dhammadinna asks a very important question. Visakha asks a very important question. Is clinging the same as the five clinging aggregates? Clinging is not the same as the five clinging aggregates, Visakha, nor is it separate. It is the nature of the five clinging aggregates to cling. It is the function of the five clinging aggregates to cling. It is the nature of anatta to cling. Excuse me. And it is the function of anatta to cling. There's a subtle distinction there that I'll get to. Clinging, these are my comments. Clinging arising from ignorance is not the same as form, feeling, perceptions, or fabrications, or consciousness. The five clinging aggregates, nor can clinging be separated from the five clinging aggregates. Does that make any sense to you? Oh, good, because it's supposed to make sense. How does it make sense?
Well, it's the method that we think. It describes the method in which we get to the point where we think.
Yes.
The aggregates have to be clung together.
Yes, so the initial action is clinging. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, they have to be clung together in order to be
Clinging.
Yes.
Aggregates that are clinging.
And in order to continue them, we have to continue clinging. And dependent origination, I think it's the 7th or 8th step. I should remember it. It talks about clinging and maintaining. That's where it's referring to. That's even a confusing part sometimes, the dependent origination. The initial clinging forms this wrong view of self. Clinging to fabricated views forms this wrong view of self that we now are using to describe who we are. So we're using views rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths to describe who we are to ourselves. I think in The Truth of Happiness, I use the line that we're playing this magic trick on ourselves and we're the magician. That confused feedback loop that the Buddha describes. And once that's established, it's continued clinging that maintains that. It maintains the five clinging aggregates. So again, it's referring, again, in a slightly obtuse way to that feedback loop of a mind rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths, reverberating against those wrong views. What Dhammadinna is teaching her husband is that clinging originates the wrong views of self in relation to the world, and once arisen, is now a part of the ongoing personal experience of suffering, known as. Thank you for asking.
Totally.
What Dhammadinna is teaching teaching her husband, is that clinging originates in wrong views of self in relation to the world. And once arisen or once established, the word arisen could seem like it's coming from an otherworldly, but we are establishing ourselves. Once established is now a part of the ongoing personal experience of suffering known as 5 clinging aggregates. So there's an initial cause rooted in craving that gives rise to establishes clinging. And once those views of self are clinging, and just for this explanation, put aside any reference to 5 clinging aggregates. I've now created a view of myself in relation to the world that is mine. I've created it. Lorna, we had a little discussion about why. Forget about why, because that's a distraction. What we need to understand is it's rooted in ignorance, because that points to the solution, to wisdom. But now I've established this view of myself in the world. In other words, I've just made the world for myself. And I've decided what I need to be happy. I've decided what I need to avoid to continue to be happy and safe. And I've established what I am not interested in the world, which is really much of what's occurring because my mind is distracted. That's the essence of self-identification. And what is it rooted in? Ignorance of 4 noble truths. That's what Dhammadinna is referring to. So Visakha now asks the question. This is what I was saying before about even these questions that Visakha are asking are so informative when we relate it to our own questions about how did I get stuck in this. Visakha asks, so how does self-identification develop? Those uninstructed with regard to the Dhamma, run-of-the-mill people, with no regard for the noble ones or those of integrity, are deluded. They're direct words, and some might take them as harsh words, but remember in the context that they're given. Visakha is asking a question. She's replying that those that are ignorant of 4 noble truths, that are ignorant of the Buddha's Dhamma, are deluded. Simple and straightforward, isn't it?
It's so straightforward. It's a teaching point.
It is.
It's not segregation or anything. It's just a teaching point.
Yep. Yep. Now, if they were having a conversation, if Visakha, I'm sorry. No, please go ahead.
Just that this is the truth that we are ignorant right now. We are.
Yeah, in the context. If Visakha and Dhammadinna are having trouble or having a discussion about their next door neighbor who painted their house some silly colors and doesn't dress properly, and they were mocking him, saying what a foolish person he is, that's wrong speech, isn't it? Because it's personalized. And it's projecting their own views of how things should be onto another person and denigrating that. And this comes up a few times, even in here, within the context of the Dhamma is what Dhammadinna is talking about. And so someone who is acting in a certain way and not having a clear understanding of the Dhamma is a misinformed, one-of-the-mill person who is deluded in relation to the Dhamma. Is that clear? Because it's such an important point that some people take offense and they say, well, must be something wrong with the Buddha for seeing, he's just seeing people clearly, and he teaches other people the importance of seeing other people clearly. That reference to run-of-the-mill people is not just a reference to so-called non-spiritual people or non-religious people. It's any person, run-of-the-mill categorizes people that have no understanding of 4 noble truths. And that includes, unfortunately, many modern Buddhist practices today. Excuse me. Dhammadinna continues. They believe that form to be the self, or that the self possesses the form. This is me. This is all I am. They are further deluded to believe that their self-referential feelings are the self. How many times do we say we describe ourselves to others based on how we feel? Almost all the time, isn't it? In fact, other people encourage it. How you feeling? Well, and that's, again, I'm not saying we shouldn't engage in common interchange, but understand how we're defining ourselves by how we feel. when we all know that feelings are impermanent, and if they're rooted in a fabricated view, those feelings can't even be trusted to describe reality, can they? They are further deluded to believe that their feelings are their self, or that their perceptions of the self, of their self, defines their self, that they're fabrications that further establish the self to be the self, and they assume that their self-referential thoughts establish the self. Look at the feedback loop involved in that, and how all of these aggregates of the 5 clinging aggregates are used to validate another aspect of these 5 clinging aggregates. My feelings lead to perceptions. My perceptions now lead to fabrications. My fabrications form feelings. And those feelings are felt in this form. Do you see the loop that I'm now established? All rooted in what? In ignorance of 4 Noble Truths. When I can develop a measure of concentration to support the refined mindfulness of the Eightfold Path, then I can see this. That's what Dhammadinna is referring to, referring Visakha back to the Eightfold Path. That's the path that we're able to develop this clear knowing. Dhammadinna continues, each of these 5 clinging aggregates are impermanent and arise from ignorance. They are anatta. They are not a self. She's declaring that each and every one of these aggregates that we use to define ourselves to ourselves in the world are anatta. They're views rooted in ignorance of 4 Noble Truths. Clear? Great sutta. Visakha asks another question that we've probably all asked once we've gotten involved in the Dhamma. So how does self-identification not develop? Those well-instructed in regard to the Dhamma, with regard to the noble ones, and those with integrity. Integrity means we've integrated the Eightfold Path in this sense. Well-disciplined in their practice do not believe form to be the self, or that feelings establish or define a self, or that perception defines a self. They are free of mental fabrications, having no foundation for fabrications. They do not assume that thoughts establish a self, or that the self possesses thoughts. Such an important line in reference, that the self possesses these thoughts, but we do, don't we?
Can you just say that?
Sure.
Possess the self, self-possess self.
They do not assume that thoughts, or before that.
That part.
They do not assume that thoughts establish a self, or that the self possesses thoughts. That again is describing the feedback loop. I've had a thought that I'm using to describe a self. From ignorance, I cling myself to that thought. The thought might be that if I'm just a little bit better, I can play center field for the Yankees when I'm 24. I clung to that for quite a while. And once I've established that thought, I now possess the thought, don't I? Why? Because it's my thought. And if anybody comes along and says, you know, at 5'7", you're never going to play center field for the Yankees, I may be very upset with them. And I was for a while. And when reality sets in at some point, it hasn't set in yet, by the way, I think I still might make it, there's great disappointment. And the disappointment isn't the Yankees' problem, and it's not the world's problem that nobody noticed me. The problem arises in the fabricated view that I should be playing center field for the Yankees, or I'm not going to be happy. And where did all that take? I'm using something pretty silly, but we do this with all kinds of things. Where did all of that take place? Yeah, not out in the world. It wasn't happening at Yankee Stadium or at the GM's mind. All of that happened within my mind. The arising of that view, that fabricated view, arose in my mind. I attached myself to the view and conditioned myself, my happiness, on achieving that view. I now possess the view. And again, I'm using a somewhat silly example, even though it actually was true in my life. We do that with all kinds of things, don't we? And we attempt to possess all types of impermanent objects, events, views, and ideas. And rooted in ignorance, we're setting ourselves up for continued confusion, rooted in that delusion that results in ongoing suffering, disappointing experiences. The well-informed do not assume that consciousness is the self or that the self possesses consciousness. There is no self attached to any of these five clinging aggregates. If we can understand that, and that's what we're moving towards, if we can understand that there is no self at all, not just post-awakening, even during a deluded experience, there is no self in form, feeling, perceptions, fabrications, or ongoing consciousness. No matter how much we all want to believe it right in this moment, it's simply not true. It's simply not true. How long do we delude ourselves? And actually let me ask a different rhetorical question. How do we understand that? That's Visakha's question. How do we bring this to cessation? Visakha then asks if the Eightfold Path is fabricated or unfabricated. And Dhammadinna replies that the Eightfold Path is fabricated. That's going to might get you a little bit, what? Wait a minute. Hold on. Let me read my. The Eightfold Path is fabricated because it's arising. This is a very important teaching that is misunderstood by. I'll say this is what separates the Buddha's Eightfold Path from everything else that I've ever read or studied or come across. In that he teaches a Dhamma that we engage with right where we are. Where most religious and spiritual teachings teach that we are to establish ourselves in some other imaginary or magical realm as awakening or as enlightenment. And it might be in a theoretical societal structure. It may be in a non-physical realm, such as if I follow this, this, and this, I'm going to end up in heaven. Or it might be that if I do enough rituals or chants, that I'll find myself in a Buddhist type of heaven. There's none of that in an Eightfold Path. The Buddha teaches from right where we are. In fact, he teaches in a way to honor where we are without clinging it. And honoring it meaning that to accept it at its most profound level, that I'm ignorant of Four Noble Truths, because that's where we start from. And you've heard me make reference to my old friend Arnold Patton. He used to say that if you're in New York and you want to go to Chicago, but you believe you're in Los Angeles, there's no way you can get there. We have to know enough about what the Buddha is teaching to start right where we are and accept that. But that is the profound brilliance of this awakened human being, because it's the only way we can awaken. How else could we? If we seek first to establish ourselves in something else other than what we are, that's also a reference to becoming and non-becoming that I won't get into, but establishing ourselves in something that's not who I am right now is simply a strategy to ignore what? Ignore ignorance. That's the brilliance of an awakened human being. That's what Siddhartha developed upon his understanding through dependent origination. It is from ignorance as a requisite condition that comes fabrications. From fabrications comes all of this, including Visakha's question. Is that clear?
So by answering that the Eightfold Path is fabrication, sort of just pointing to that.
Yes, it's saying.
The question in and of itself was seeking to establish the self in that thought of the Eightfold Path.
Yes, and that's the caution, because we can become we can possess the Eightfold Path, and that gives us license to change it, doesn't it? Because now it's mine, or dismiss parts of it. And then we can end up with, now say I don't like right view, right intention, right speech, action, livelihood, right effort, or right mindfulness, but I really like right meditation. So I'm just going to make a Dhamma practice out of meditation. That's something that's rooted in modern Buddhist practice that started in something called the Yogacara school, which means the mind-only school. And again, not to put it down, that is the foundation for modern Zen meditation. modern Zen practice, a mind-only school. And it's because of that. Let me continue. The Eightfold Path is fabricated, arising from form, feelings, and perceptions. These are my comments, by the way. As it is a teaching developed within the sphere of impermanent phenomenal world. In other words, the Buddha taught a path, again, that meets us where we are, but takes us out of that path through the concentration and refined mindfulness that's developed within that path. And another way of saying that is within our own ignorance, we develop profound wisdom. Not by running away from ignorance. It's not by finding an escape from ignorance. It's by starting right where we are.
So I was just sorry to interrupt.
Oh, please.
I'm having a conversation with a friend. It's like, why can, at times you like hold this mindfulness of each moment, be really present, and, it kind of flows like that. And other times you watch yourself like cling and crave, and it's not, why, do we have to do that? And I thought like, well, in my experience, I'm having to watch like the ignorance of myself in order to learn more about it, in order to walk the path. Like I just, it's like there's an experience, I know, because of some level of concentrated mind, there's this experience of just seeing the ignorance at work. And so that's where you are.
Yep. That's it. Thank you. And you got to come to more Saturday classes. that's really brilliant. And your conversation, the response kind of touched on something that's often misunderstood. The Buddha taught meditation to deepen our concentration. We went through this series of talks on jhana. That's the purpose of meditation, so that we can develop the refined mindfulness to not so much to be mindfully present with every impermanent phenomena that arises and passes away, but to be able to see the impermanent phenomena that's arising and passing away from the point of view of right view. That's the Buddha's description of refined mindfulness. My word is refined mindfulness. He doesn't use it. Mindfulness in this sense means to see things from the point of view of right view. In other words, in relation to this sutta, it's seeing things from a profound understanding of three marks of existence, of the impermanence of all things. Having recognized views rooted in self, rooted in ignorance, or not a self, I've let go of those views. So I'm no longer seeing things. Something that can happen from a misunderstanding of mindfulness is that now that I need to be mindful of washing the dishes. That's not mindfulness. It's good to be present while you're washing the dishes. What's more important is to be mindful of the impermanence and not taking anything personal there. And so there's no suffering that arises, including the tension that might arise from thinking that I have to be mindfully present with washing the dishes. No, I need to be mindfully aware of right view in relation to washing the dishes. Do you see the significant but subtle difference? And so a mind resting in right view doesn't have to be mindful of washing the dishes or mindful of this or mindful of that. That tension is gone. It's a mind resting in peace, no matter if it's washing dishes or driving a car or in the midst of a political debate that's not going away or anything else. Simply present. And it's not even an awareness of, wow, look how mindful I am now. Look at the eye making in that. I am the most mindful person I know. So you bring up such a great point. Thank you. Let me continue. These are still my comments. The intention of the Eightfold Path is to bring understanding to those under the delusion that their belief in self requires clinging to what is in reality anicca or impermanent, and we all do that. That's how impermanence and the not self characteristic are intertwined. We simply don't see it. The Eightfold Path is a path of skillful means to developing the unfabricated quality of mind of release from clinging, and most importantly, clinging to wrong views of self. Once cessation of clinging mind is accomplished, when awakening has occurred, the Eightfold Path is abandoned, meaning it's not that we no longer practice all those tenets of an Eightfold Path. It's now become integrated. This is what, when I refer to a life well integrated, that's what I mean. The Eightfold Path is simply an ongoing natural expression of who you are. That's an awakened state. An awakened human being has integrated the three characteristics of wisdom, virtue, and concentration. The Arahant remains harmless to themselves and others, their mind resting in equanimity. And again, there's no self-referential thought at that point. Am I doing this right? Am I in right speech, right intention, etc.? We simply do it. And it also relates to a great question I got maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago from an online student. And I was never asked this question before. I said, why did the Buddha keep meditating after he was awake? And I had to think a little bit about it. Why would he? But listen, look at what's in that question. There's a certain displeasure in their meditation practice because they're grasping after something. After a moment of thinking about it, my answer was, why wouldn't an awakened human being continue to meditate? It's an ongoing pleasant abiding, isn't it? Vipassana then inquires if the qualities of virtue, concentration, and wisdom are developed through the Eightfold Path, or do these three qualities inspire the Eightfold Path? Another great question. Vipassana, the Eightfold Path, is inspired by the qualities of virtue, concentration, and wisdom. Right speech, right action, and right livelihood inspire the development of heightened virtue. Right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration inspire the development of heightened concentration. And right view and right intention inspire the development of heightened wisdom. So it's a threefold path. I'm going to skip over some of my commentary. Vipassana then asks, what is concentration, and what is the framework for right concentration? What are the requisites, and how is it developed? Samadhi, non-distraction, is concentration. The framework for right concentration is the four foundations of mindfulness: being mindful of the breath in the body, being mindful of feelings arising and passing away, being mindful of thoughts occurring and fading away, and being mindful of the present quality of mind. We all do that in our meditation practice, correct? I mean, that's the beginning of the four foundations of mindfulness, where the Buddha's teaching how to properly meditate, what to do with feelings and thoughts as they arise. That's it. Now, you also know that the Buddha taught meditation in this way to deepen concentration, and for no other reason. Excuse me. Right effort provides the requisites for right concentration. You should always endeavor with skillful desire and persistence for the non-arising of unskillful qualities, and to abandon unskillful qualities that have yet arisen. It simply means to be, like Laura was just saying, it simply means to be mindful of what's present. And if in my meditation practice I notice an unskillful quality, which might be being distracted by a feeling, or having a feeling or a thought arise that leads to wanting more of what that's bringing to mind, to simply recognize the unskillful quality of greed or aversion or any deluded thinking immediately. Again, we shouldn't get into an analytical type of meditation. Come back to the sensation of breathing. And Vipassana always endeavor with great desire and persistence to generate skillful qualities that have yet arisen, and to maintain skillful qualities that have arisen. What skillful qualities should be mindful of? Part of the Eightfold Path. Am I developing right view, right intention, etc.? Am I using the path the way it's intended? These aren't, excuse me. There's nothing conceptual here. It's direct, and it's related and framed by the Eightfold Path. There's nothing we have to imagine for ourselves. We know what unskillful and skillful qualities are. And an act of concentration supporting refined mindfulness is to recognize when skillful qualities have arisen and to hold those in mind. And we talked about that even when we were going through the the talks on jhana and even on restraint. The Buddha consistently taught something that is, again, often misunderstood and overlooked, that it is just as important to be mindful of what's no longer present, aspects of ignorance, excuse me, as it is to be mindful of what's developing, what is present, concentration, and refined mindfulness. Always. Well, maybe, once we're awakened, but even it was an important part of the Buddha's teaching and awakened human beings' teachings and those others that taught the Buddha's Dhamma to consistently point out what it wasn't, unskillful qualities, as it was to point out what skillful qualities we are to maintain. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Especially any mind that still has a measure of fabrication or conditioning will very easily fall back into unskillful qualities unless we're able to be mindful of where we're going. Our concentration is deepening and are more engaged in the 8 factors of the Eightfold Path. Dhammadinna, Visakha then asks, what are fabrications, dear lady? There are 3. There's bodily fabrications, verbal fabrications, and mental fabrications. Simply, that's the type of beings that we are. So that's where our fabrications will arise and pass away. In and out breaths are bodily fabrications, as breaths are generated from the clinging aggregate of form. What do you think about that?
Partly true.
Partly, in the beginning of Dhamma practice, the simple act of being mindful of our in and out breaths is still an aspect of fabrication, isn't it? Now remember, as we went through the series of jhana, how the first jhana is directed by a pleasantness arising from the seclusion, but accompanied by directed thought and evaluation. Everybody remembers that? That's what this is referring to. In that first jhana, as our thoughts are directed. I am directing my thoughts now to, when I find that I'm thinking, I put my thoughts back on my breathing. And some of us in that first jhana may be even evaluating that. Why do I have to do it? Why am I doing it? Is this really wherever that distraction might take us? But that's what's being referred to here also. It's fabricated because of its initial nature. Because those breaths are generated from the clinging aggregate of form, feelings and perceptions are mental fabrications, as they are generated by the clinging aggregates of feeling and perceptions. That's clear, isn't it? Conditioned and discursive thought and evaluation are verbal fabrications, as they are generated from the clinging aggregate of consciousness. Now, we also learned through the understanding of jhana, that as we deepen our concentration, especially that last sutta where the Buddha used Sariputta as an example, even at that 4th level of jhana, there's ever deepening levels of concentration. But those are all characterized by an also ever deepening level of a pleasant abiding. I'm going to skip over some commentary too. How then does the attainment of cessation of feelings and perceptions develop? A well-informed person who has developed understanding through the Eightfold Path does not have a thought of attainment. Again, it kind of goes back to that question too, why the Buddha kept meditating after he awakened. The same with the Eightfold Path. We now have fully developed and integrated the Eightfold Path. It's not something we are striving after. It's simply how we live our lives. And so, and some of us have had this experience, maybe all of us, and I've talked about it before. There's such a subtle but powerful freedom when we know that we're living within the framework of the Eightfold Path, because there's no longer any reason to second guess ourselves. And we also understand what's occurring in the outside world, which means we no longer have to approve of it. We're not judging it as right or wrong or how it might affect me. And we simply accept it because it's what's occurring. Call that radical acceptance. That's what the Buddha taught. There's nothing left to disturb my mind. It doesn't mean that we're not living in a deluded state by thinking everything is wonderful, because it can't be. That denies the first noble truth. It simply means that I understand the nature of the unpleasantness and the disappointment that's common in the world. the Eightfold Path does not have a thought of attainment. Rather, their refined mind leads to the cessation of feelings and perceptions. Verbal fabrications cease, then bodily fabrications, and finally mental fabrications. Notice it doesn't say that we stop feeling or thinking or sensing, but the views rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths resulting in fabrications have now fallen away. And so we are now simply experiencing life as it is and as it occurs, without the need for it to be any different, which clouds our experience. What that radical idea means is that for the first time in our lives, we are actually living our life because we don't need it to be any different. And that is such a, at times, and most times, it's such a subtle veil between what's occurring and what we're missing that we can't even see that. But when the veil is lifted, every single moment in life is meaningful, not because of what it is, it's because we're present for it. And that changes everything. That's what the Buddha awakened to. I should stop on that note because it's grammatic, but I won't. That's just ending fabrications brings us to that point. My comment here, this process directly relates to right speech and verbal fabrications, right action and bodily fabrications, and the three concentration factors and the cessation of mental fabrications. Skip over the rest of that commentary. Dhammadinna continues. When a well-informed person, meaning someone who has developed the Four Noble Truths, emerges from the cessation of feelings and perceptions, they are empty of clinging. Free of self-identification, going back to what started all this with Visakha. Free of self-identification and conditioned mind. The well-informed person's mind inclines to seclusion and away from delight and entanglement with the world. Does it mean we don't engage in the world anymore? We do it from a mindful present. And we appreciate those moments, and maybe longer than moments of seclusion, of withdrawing ourselves intentionally through meditation and maybe just not being mentally entangled with the world. These are my comments here. The Buddha describes an awakened human being very simply as unbound from clinging, and the quality of mind of an awakened human being as calm. This may seem rather simplistic and mundane, but when seen within the context of Four Noble Truths, it is clearly seen that the endless cycle of wandering through samsara, wandering around in ignorance, anatta, subject to continuous confusion and disappointment, has been brought to cessation. The remainder of human life can be lived in lasting peace and happiness. Visakha asks, how many kinds of feelings are there? There are only three types of feelings, Visakha. There is a pleasant feeling, a painful feeling, and a neutral feeling. When we attach our feelings to events, they develop all types of different characteristics and all different types of meaning. But underlying that, there's only these three types of feelings: pleasant, painful, and neutral. A pleasant feeling that changes, because they will, becomes painful because of impermanence. They will. Painful feelings that change can become pleasant, leading to confusion, right? Neutral feelings may change as well to either pleasure or pain. All feelings are subject to anicca, to impermanence. This is where this whole teaching now is referencing the three marks of existence. Pleasant feelings can give rise to passion obsession. Painful feelings can give rise to resistance obsession. Neutral feelings can give rise to ignorance obsession. Obsession is another word for reaction and continued resistance. When a well-informed person is withdrawn from the obsession of sensual fulfillment and withdrawn from unskillful qualities through meditative absorption, through jhana, they abandon passion and passion obsession. Yearning for final liberation, resistance obsession is abandoned. Deepening meditative absorption, ignorance obsession is abandoned. You see how the Dhamma practice that the Buddha teaches directly addresses these problems arising out of ignorance. Is that clear? Dear lady, what then, this is an interesting part to me, and I think it comes up to almost every one of us once we start grasping an understanding of what the Buddha's teaching really does and what's going to happen to me when I awaken and let go of all these things that are self-referential. Dear lady, what then lies on the other side of ignorance? So it's not enough to just understand and abandon ignorance, is it? And I think many of us have at least had that thought. Clear knowing or true insight lies on the other side of ignorance. And Visakha, with clear knowing comes release from clinging. Release from clinging comes complete unbinding. Visakha, despite his understanding, continues to cling to the need to establish a self after liberation. He just heard these wonderful teachings that will liberate him once and for all. Yet, he says, Dhammadinna, what lies on the other side of unbinding? What happens when I let go of all self-referential views? Visakha, you have gone too far. Your clinging mind has demanded too many answers, and your question will lead to only more confusion and suffering. We had that talk this morning, didn't we? Really, what is it? What's beyond ignorance? How do I get here? It's the same question. How did I get to this point? Why am I here? That's all part of this, what's beyond this. I'm going to go back. Your clinging mind has demanded too many answers. That's important too, because a self-referential mind will, and this is another way that we continue to ignore ignorance, will put up one scenario after another to why this doesn't work, and I need to have, and insist that I must have the answer to this before I'll develop that. And I just went through this with someone online who had a particular ideology that she insisted must be addressed through the Buddha's teaching in a way that was satisfying to her before she would take up the Buddha's teaching. And of course, all I could say to her is, if you would take up the Buddha's teaching, you'd realize that your question is an irrelevant question. That didn't go too far. But that's very common. And so this is something that the Mahasangikas did 150 years after the Buddha's passing. They wanted the Dhamma to be different than the Buddha taught, so it would provide answers to their, my word now, foolish questions that have no relevance to the Dhamma. And so they completely transformed what the Buddha's teaching to what is now modern Mahayana Buddhism. Visakha, you have gone too far. Your clinging mind has demanded too many answers, and your question will lead to only more confusion and suffering. As the Buddha said in many suttas, it's your questions that are confusing you. Let go of your questions. The Buddha's path, the Eightfold Path, culminates in unbinding. It doesn't go any further. That's enough. Is that not enough? If you wish, go to the Buddha and ask him. Let his answer be enough. So Visakha was delighted in her teachings. He bowed to her and left for the Buddha. Finding the Buddha nearby, he sat to one side of the Buddha and recounted what Dhammadinna told him. The Buddha replied, Dhammadinna is very wise and of great discernment. I would have answered your questions exactly as she has. This is how you should remember these teachings. Visakha was pleased by the Buddha's confirmation. Thank you. The end of the sutta. Boy, what a remarkable sutta in its completeness in relating the Dhamma in very simple and direct terms. If you read the sutta, you know that I think there's 14 or 15 footnotes attached to this, because it does reference so much of the Buddha's Dhamma. But it's also a standalone teaching, isn't it? It speaks right to the three marks of existence. So let's go around the room and see if you have any questions or comments. Florida, we'll start with you. Good morning.
This morning I found the teaching just so rich, it kind of just like overwhelmed me. But I haven't latched on to it. Stands out specifically. But it, more than anything, it has to reinforce the form, feeling, perception, mental application.
Yeah.
And just how we misuse those feelings and thoughts, how we misuse them in a thinking sense, and not just use them as they are supposed to be used. This is just my body, and
Yeah.
which is, we attach that story to it. And in among all you've said, I think that's the thing that's really come across this morning, much of anything. But it's almost overpoweringly rich.
Yeah.
It, say it's just very heavy teaching in a lot of ways. But obviously very to the point, very realistic to how life is. We can all identify to it.
Yeah.
In different aspects, which you wrap your head around what you're saying. We can all see the truth in it. But unraveling our own specific truth in a day-to-day module is the trick.
Yeah.
But you have to break it down into little pieces and just understand little pieces. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. And you're referring to right effort. And an important aspect that's lost when we think it's just meditation, or even just coming and listening to this guy once a week or whenever you come. Part of right effort is actually studying things like this and understanding it at a very profound level, and making the connection and seeing it in the right context. This as a standalone teaching, if you didn't know anything else, it would be really hard to make sense of it, wouldn't it?
Yes.
But when you have the right context and you know how it fits, then it's a very profound teaching, isn't it? Thank you. Anthony, good to see you.
Good morning, everyone. I got a lot out of it. I thought, like Lauren said, it was very rich.
Yeah.
I think one of the answers to your question about why the Buddha keeps meditating is because the Buddha is human.
Yeah.
And the Buddha can fall off the path just like anyone. So, and I think
That's right.
it circles back to what Laura said about, how we need to have these, harsh experiences or harsh thoughts to appreciate where we are on the path. And so it's not that mindfulness isn't necessarily being perfect. It's just being not judgmental when you're not perfect.
Oh, it's a big part of that. Yeah.
And yeah, that's to me is a part of the message of this. And like we were saying last week, that you don't want to embrace your depression, you just want to recognize it.
Yeah.
You want to recognize, because embracing it takes you too much in the other direction, where it now becomes a cult.
Yep.
I'm one of the depressed people.
Yeah, that's right.
So.
And there's more self-identification.
Exactly. I mean.
Yeah.
So so thanks for that. I always come out of here feeling so good.
Thank you. So do I. That aspect, I know we talked about it a little bit, but that aspect of mindfulness as it applies to when you recognize that you're not acting 100% perfectly is an aspect of being mindful of right intention and right effort and the rest of the Eightfold Path, isn't it? An aspect of being gentle with yourself.
Yeah.
But that's important, so important to hold
not
that in
being
mind.
so harsh with
Yeah.
yourself.
Just recognize what's skillful. As this sutta points out, what is skillful and what is unskillful. And if it didn't need to be pointed out, human beings would simply be skillful, but we're not. We are unskillful at times.
I think we take things out of context a lot. Like if we're in a 20-minute conversation and we say one dumb thing, we walk away kicking ourselves in the face.
Yeah.
And really, I don't think people are judging it that harshly most of the time.
Yeah.
They're taking the overall picture and looking at it.
That's right.
More in context than we do with ourselves.
Yeah, but falling into that trap of maybe one misspoken word is kind of the essence of wrong view, isn't it?
I find myself
self-referential view.
Thinking about something I said like 3 hours later.
Yeah.
So I think I've gotten better at that, though. I've gotten better at just cutting the ties.
You have
All
to.
right, that's what it was. Tomorrow will be something different.
Yeah. That's right. And again, as we develop the Eightfold Path as our way of living in the world, all of that falls away. There's such great freedom and power in that.
Impermanence.
Yeah. Thank you. Jen, good to see you this morning.
Thank you. So, thank you. And
And I don't mean to put you on the spot. Nobody has to talk here, so you're free to say anything you'd like. Okay.
I think I would. This sounds like something I would like to hear again and again because it's could be. It's, the incorporation of it is very important.
Yeah.
And also the words self-compassion and compassion for others resonate with others.
Yeah. The more you come here, the more you'll hear me say this. The most loving thing we can do for ourselves and for all others is to take to the Dhamma and awaken. It's the essence of self-compassion and other compassion. It's not to say that you can't be that way. You don't do this, but this brings you there. I think, do you know that all of these talks are recorded and they're on the website and the articles are, so you can listen to it and read it? Okay. Okay, and also, and I'm not sure how far along you are with these teachings, but on the website there's a page that introduces the website and then an introduction to what the Buddha teaches, and there's some talks on that help establish the foundation in the context. So I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to that or read that, but it would be helpful. The teachings really aren't all that difficult to integrate, but they are pretty broad in their application, and it takes a little while. But if you remember that the Buddha awakened to something called dependent origination, and his first teaching was the Four Noble Truths. Everything the Buddha taught for his entire 45-year teaching career was taught in the context of those first two teachings. And then you can start seeing how these things apply. But it takes a little bit of time and right effort, that sixth factor of the Eightfold Path. So I hope you continue to join us here. Pleasure to have you. Jen, good to see you.
Reviewing dependent. I mean, I felt it would be just on my driving propensity to cling and crave that you have to drop that. You practice that and practice not that.
Yeah.
Practice interrupting.
Yep.
And it's nice to sort of see that there's a choice there. Interrupt the process that leads to suffering. Just by recognizing, just by watching what's happening for a moment. Not perhaps 2 hours. So, it's good.
Yeah. Thank you, Jen. Yeah. Each moment holds the potential to awaken. That's the choice we have right here, right now. And I should say, we shouldn't be rigid or fixated on that. That should be just a natural expression of integrating the Eightfold Path. Am I seeing this in right view? Laura, good to see you.
I appreciate this teaching so much because it really touches on all these subtleties of our conditioning, and kind of that, how the subtlety of kind of bringing it out of that, looking at portal is kind of pulling it out of that ignorant way of being, subtle practice noticing that that's occurring through the questions that are being asked and how they're being responded to. Yeah, so it's a good teaching. Appreciate that about these teachings, how they focus like the whole picture so often. This one just really kind of lays it all out there. I was also just thinking about this idea that you had mentioned about the feelings, about like the pleasant and unpleasant and neutral feelings. Yeah, I just found that an interesting thought to look at and kind of see the truth of that in working with really, really young children. Kind of a little bit new to it, how it is like I like it or I don't like it or I'm not responding to it. And then they may like it and the next minute they don't like it. So just seeing that there's so much truth to that, and that as we get older and as we're in the world more, we put more on it. We want, you describe your feelings, or let's label them, and you get more of these fabrications and through your conditioning and your experience. It was just an interesting thought that occurred to me.
Thank you. We do, to a large extent, reinforce children's and each other's fabrications, don't we? By overemphasizing feelings. Not going to resolve that this morning. That's next week. Becky, good to see you.
Really good to be here, as always. Thank you, John.
Glad you're here.
Like everyone, I just felt that this teaching is just all encompassing. And it certainly is a teaching that needs to be revisited because there's so much depth to it. There's just another layer of depth that is just if you just can think about what you heard in this that you never really heard before, and there are things that I heard that I never really heard before, and that just makes you want to, just makes you want to understand it at that level. Because, there's a whole other level of understanding that I realize by listening to this. And I'm not saying that I understand it at that level, I just know that level's there. Yeah. And it needs to be probed and revisited and thought. But the one I find that I need to to have like just sort of a one view focus. And it can be different from week to week or from moment to moment, but my focus from this, I just got mindfully present. Just work on that for a while.
That's a good thing to look
Just think about just mindful presence. You know what that means? You've experienced it, so you can do it. So that can be what we think about for now, instead of, because you can get overwhelmed. But thank you, that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Becky. Mindful presence is a good thing to have. It reminds me of an old Dudley Moore movie. I think it was 10. He says, fun's the best thing to have. Mindful presence is the best thing to have. I'm sorry, Anthony.
No problem. Could you tell us a little of the backstory here? Like, how is it, do nuns, Buddhist nuns couldn't be married anymore? Is that why they're broken up?
You mean current day or now in
No,
Buddhist
the
time?
the nun,
Thank you, Jen, for being here. Hope to see you soon.
the nun telling that story, you said is telling it to her ex-husband. So why is he an ex-husband?
Well, in order for her to be initiated into the order, she had to be divorced. She could have continued as a lay
Like
follower.
the Catholics.
Yeah, that was, and it had nothing. People always want to say, well, it's because we don't want people having sex. And that's the first. It's really not that, especially in the Buddha's original Sangha. Even the idea that you went into seclusion, meaning the Sangha always established itself away from the town, even though they might be near a town for alms. Simply for that reason that if you are devoted that deeply to the Dhamma, you need to just be focused on the Dhamma. And if you were married, you had to be worried about your spouse, and in her case, you'd have to be cooking and cleaning, and etc. There's some of the Theragatha, the poems of the awakened nuns, that speak to this. I think that was one of the last two that I posted. She talked about this crooked old man that smelled like a fish vessel that she left behind. You could just see the frustration having to take care of her husband all these years, and the freedom now, however you want to look at it, of leaving that behind and developing the Dhamma. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, I'm just wondering how they became ex.
Yeah, it was just, I haven't come across any other reason why that would be. There is no real backstory, but that would be it.
And obviously they remain close. Or should we be teaching?
Oh yeah, there wasn't.
Be talking to them?
Yeah, there's not any hard feelings, and he is a devoted lay practitioner that developed the Dhamma nicely. Yeah, that whole history of women in Buddhism is just such a mess. Even in many modern Theravada schools, they still don't allow women in because the Buddha taught not to allow women in. And all you got to do is just read the suttas. And that whole thing came from, well, I probably should qualify and then close the class quickly. When the Buddha's aunt, who was his mother, who raised him, about 3 or 4 years into his teaching career, wanted to become part of the original Sangha, along with his aunt, and I can't think of her name, and his aunt, mother, sister, whatever that would be. And he said that they couldn't because the societal conditions at the time, much like they are today in India and even parts of the world, unfortunately, were such that he was concerned that they would be murdered if they allowed them to get in any position of social presence in the hierarchy.
Wow.
And he said, if I let you in, you're going to get killed. And they insisted that was, and maybe you could say they changed the Buddha's mind on that, but that was their responsibility, and so he let them in. I never did come across any stories of violence then after that, but there was always a resistance to that. And as soon as after the Buddha passed, the Theravadins and the Mahasanghikas very quickly rewrote the rules, so now there was no longer any women that could. The rule was that the Theravada rule that was established, that was in order for new female novices to be allowed into the Sangha, there had to be at least one male teacher and one female teacher. And so think of, as people died off, the female teacher was no longer around, and the male teacher refused to be present for it. And so there was no way to initiate. They changed the rules, no way to initiate women. And the Theravadins still hold on to that rule. And they changed that rule to saying, once there was no more women in the Sangha, then they changed the rule saying that a woman must be present in order to initiate other women. Of course, now there's none left in the world. It was just pure manipulation. And again, not something that Buddha ever intended. And that's changing today. There's many traditions that do allow women, but even a lot of those traditions, the women are somewhat subservient to the men, which is really unfortunate, because if it wasn't for many of the women in the original Sangha, there wouldn't be a Sangha today. Okay, that's enough of my pontificating. And I think, next Saturday, if you can stay after, it'd be greatly appreciated, but don't feel like you have to. I know people are busy, but we're going to have a little ceremony, maybe a little Qigong class. We'll eat some cake, have a little coffee or tea, and we'll move out. So if you can help us, that'd be great. And we'll finish today like we always do with Metta. We'll find your relaxed meditation posture and become mindful of your in-breath and your out-breath. And these are the Buddha's words on Metta from the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing, in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. Radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. Whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Thank you all for wonderful classes. Peace.